So hey, by special request, I have been asked to make a video about traditional basket making. I'm not a tribal member. I was taught by basket maker Julia Parker and have been making baskets since I was a teenager, so like since I was like 16 or something, in that neighborhood. So I was taught the traditional way, so that's what I'm going to be showing you. Again, I am not a tribal member. I want to make that super crystal clear so that there's no, cultural appropriation accusations or anything like that. This is just something that I do because I know how to do it. And I wanted to show you, and people seemed interested in the topic. So that's why I'm doing this one. So let's start with the basis of most California Indian baskets, and that is the willow plant. Wow, the sun is very bright. This one's a pretty good one. If I was going to be gathering it, I would have done it in the spring. You can see that there is a lot of little short growth. If I was going to be collecting and gathering from this particular plant, what I would have done in the early spring is cut some of these branches so that you get some of the longer branches like that. You want, the super long, uninterrupted, no little branchlets coming off it type of branch. And you want to gather that in spring when the water is coming up into the branches so that the bark slips off easily. That is the opposite of what you want to do with redbud, which makes the color in baskets, and I'll show you that in just a second. But first, meanwhile, at the creek, I've had some basket materials soaking so that they get soft. And the reason I've done it in the creek is because the water at my house is full of iron and will turn everything black if I try and soak it there. Plus, you can see how big this is. The only place I can do this is in my bathtub. And even then, again, the water in my house it'll discolor everything. So let me take these nice wet plants that I got and bring them back to the house. So here's a native western redbud, CERCIS occidentalis, and this is the red coloring in baskets. You want the first year's growth without any interruptions in, little branches and stuff like that. Let's see if I can find a good one. That's a pretty, oh, here's a good one. So you can see it, long, straight, no branchlets, and that's really the best. The older they get, the more they kind of lose their red color. So you want the youngest things that have the most red color. And you want to get this in the fall when the leaves have completely gone off, because then the water is coming back out of the branch and the bark will stick on, which is what you really want. Okay, so the first thing I want to do before these dry out anymore is get working on these large willow branches. These were gathered some time ago, and you're supposed to let them dry for at least a year before you work with them, and that allows them to completely cure so you're not accidentally working with something green. What you're going to be doing is just splitting this. A lot of people will split it 3 ways. I split it 2 ways just because it's just easier for me to control and not waste material with a bad split that runs off. So I just do split it in half. And what I'm trying to accomplish here, getting it into a bundle that is much easier to store. And I don't know if I can do this one because it is still kind of dry in the middle. I need to actually let some of these soak longer. Let me find a thinner one. So here's a thinner one. And again, I'm just gonna, get that blade in there halfway, splitting it in half. And then it becomes much more flexible and easier to store it. And it saves a lot of space. So you don't have these giant long branches. Like, where are you going to put those in your house? Well, in my small house, it is actually not easy to store something like this. So now that I have the opportunity to do this for this video, and yeah, see, some of these areas are already drying out a bit, and I can hear it cracking as I'm trying to work with this. This is not ideal, so. Okay, I've got a number of things to show you. I'm soaking the beginnings of one that I've been working on for a little while. I'm getting it wet. I don't want to soak the whole thing as if I can avoid it, just because it eventually will kind of not rot or damage, but just it'll kind of weaken that middle, and you don't want that. So I'm trying to keep just the edge wet on this. And while that's soaking, I'll show you a few of the tools I use. You're going to get little bits of stuff everywhere, so you're going to want a cloth for your lap. Here's a knife I've used for years and years. That is just one I found in my backyard many years ago. I like it. It's a good size. It's easy to keep sharp. So I've just used it, and it's just become my basket knife. It's just a thing, right? So that, I have a bone awl to make holes between the rows. I'll show you how I use that in just a minute. It is fragile. It will break if you're too rough with it. I've made them also out of long metal tapestry needles that's been put into a bit of dowel as a handle. That's another way you can do it. It makes it much thinner too, so that can be a benefit. Here's a basket that I made a number of years ago with a simple kind of a pine cone design, I guess is what they would call it. You can see that the start of it is a different color. This is sedge, and it's much easier to work with in small, tight radiuses, radii. It's more flexible and it's stronger than willow, but what I have available to me mostly is willow. I don't have a sedge bed. I don't have really any access to any sedges. And the one place I knew of that I could buy them before has stopped selling them. So all my baskets by default, by force, have to be out of willow, which is not my favorite material, honestly, because it's more brittle. It's not as strong. It's more difficult to get down to where you can actually weave with it this finely. My design is redbud, and that's the plant that I was just showing you. Here's a little coil of redbud that I prepared several years ago that's been nice and dry. I've got some of it soaking here because I'm going to start actually putting a design in. Now that the base is done, I'm just starting to curve up the edges. It's going to be, I hope, a standard size cooking basket about yay big. But here's my redbud that I have prepared and dried in bundles. So, because when you have it like just split down in half, it's a bit rough and wild, unwieldy and large. But then when you split it again one more time, then it's much thinner, and it's the next, you're going to be splitting it down several times until it's thin enough to make your final basket weaving material with, like that. So here is also some other things. This is black that is bracken fern root. Comes out a natural brown anyway, and you can leave it brown. So you've got your reddish brown of the redbud, the black if you want to dye it. If you don't dye it, it's just a nice kind of medium brown. If you do dye it, put it in a bucket full of like nails and pieces of metal and iron and things like that to kind of discolor it on purpose, and use the iron to your advantage to turn it black like that. Now I'm talking mostly about Central California, and in some areas they would use pine branches off the bull pine, which is pretty long, and you can also get pine nuts out of that. It's very, very stiff and strong. It's much thicker, much more coarse to work with, but it can be used in the same way as the willows or other, similar materials. Here's a basket start. Let me see. Here's my willow basket start, right? And then here's one that I did entirely of sedge before I started realizing, you know what, I can't get any more of this. So I'm just going to stop right here and use this as a demonstration to show people, as I sometimes do demonstrations. I go to museums or, Living History Day or something like that, and we'll show people these things so that they can handle them and understand how these are made. So a cooking basket, this is like a small model. It should be much, much larger and wider, but this shape is a cooking basket, and they would cook. In my previous video, I talked about acorns and acorn mush. Once you get the acorn mush in there and you get this wet, everything tightens up to the point where, yes, it would hold water. And they would take a looped twig, basically big stick, and then I have a couple of cooking rocks here. These are well used. You can see all the little holes from that's how you can tell a cooking rock is all these little volcanic holes all over it. This is a very well used cooking rock. I have a couple of these that I discovered at an undisclosed location that I don't want people knowing about. But they would take that and just, cradle the cooking rock in the looped stirring stick and just hold it down in the basket, ideally not letting it touch the basket because it's absolutely red hot out of the fire, and stir it around until the acorn mush would boil. Another useful tool is a brush made out of soaproot fibers. This is where the bulb of the plant would be, right? And then the leaves grow up this way. But if you peel them off, you can make kind of a soap, but also kind of a putty if you boil the soaproot down and get this mush out of it and make a handle for itself. It's been tied with string here and then coated with the soaproot mush. This one is not waterproof. If I were to get this wet, this would immediately turn right back into soap. But if you mix it with pitch or anything waterproof like that and make a handle, then you have a waterproof brush. And it's quite nice. Often they would use this for brushing acorn flour out of a basket or out of a pounding hole, getting it up out of there, or for hair brushes, anything you need a brush for. These are very handy. Another little tool I have here is a tiny, tiny piece of obsidian flake that would have been flaked off of making another larger tool. And these little flakes would be kept there, volcanic glass, so they can be quite sharp for scraping off bark. If you've got extra stuff, attached to your willows, you want to scrape those until they're nice and clean. You can use these as a cutting tool instead of a knife if you prefer. Many basket makers still use obsidian today as in the traditional way. I don't. It's harder to get. It can be a little bit dangerous if it flakes off and then you've lost. It's like being in a sewing room and you've dropped a needle. It's like, oh, where'd that just go? So I just don't. But I have it in my kit to just kind of show people. Another type of decoration would have been, and is, quail top knots. Now, California quail have this little dangly bit on the top of their head, and because it is a game bird, quail are game birds. They can be legally hunted here in California, and I had a friend of mine who hunted them and kept the male heads for me, which sounds really gruesome, but but what that did is it enabled me to get a number of these quail top knots that are decoration in traditional baskets. As you're weaving, you would stick it in there. This would have been done in gift baskets that you're giving to someone for like a wedding or something like that. So very, very special use for that. Red feathers from the acorn woodpecker was also very popular. Yellow from the meadowlark was another that was used quite a bit. Later years, red yarn was used in gift baskets and much the same way. Beads, clamshell disc beads, all different kinds of beads, glass beads when they came in. So lots of different ways to decorate, either through the design itself or, stitching in beads and feathers and things like that. So everything should be wet enough to get started. I've already got one going here. This is a splice between two different ones, the new one and the old one. You have to be able to add a new strand, right? Okay, I'm ready to splice in the new piece. This one obviously has gotten quite short. I can't do any more with it, so I'm going to take my awl and kind of separate these previous stitches. Right, so I leave a little space in there, and then I'm just going to fold this underneath the core and kind of lock it into that little space in between the stitches. It's going to come out the other side, and that's fine. That's what these are doing, right? And then I'm going to reverse the process with the other piece and go through the previous row, stitch it through there, leave a little tail, and then that is going to get, you guessed it, put underneath the core, and that locks these in place like that, and the core will pinch that off, And then when you're a little ways down the road, you can just take your knife and kind of pull and cut at the same time and just trim off those little butt ends like that. Being very careful not to cut your stitching. And just trim those little ends off. So then you're just going to go through this same hole again and then just continue on as if nothing ever happened. You want to try and not get the tip of this wet because it's like a sewing needle. You have to be able to push this through the previous row. And I go between the previous row's stitches and then under this rod that's in the previous row and just very gently get it so that it's, and I look and see what I'm doing so I don't split the previous stitch, and carefully poke this up between those stitches at that angle. And then after that point, it's a race against time to get your little pointed tip in this hole before it closes up. So pull it out, stick it in there rather quickly, and we're through. Yay! Sometimes what I have to do is grab that little tiny tip in my teeth to get it started and really pull it tight and get it through there. If it kind of gets stuck in the hole, that is a way to get it through, is to just grab it in your front teeth. And as you can see, it takes a very long time, and half of the time or more is just preparing the materials for your stitching, because you have to shave this down so very finely. And let me show you how that is done. And I'm looking at my curve to make sure it's even as I'm starting to go up on my edges. But let me show you how to get it to this point. It has to be very flexible, very pliable. It can't be stiff, it can't be too thick, or it will crack and strip itself and come apart. So it's got to be just the right thickness, and that you do that by feel, really. The width is by eye, but the thickness is by feel, definitely. And obviously that's way too thick. I mean, that's not going to work, so that has to be trimmed way down. But before I even get to that point, it's so big and so wide that I'm just going to immediately start just pulling this way and pushing that way and kind of getting a little bit to split off. And then just peeling that thinner. So it's not, because if I try to trim the width at this point, it's just going to make a really thick stick that is it's going to be kind of brittle and more difficult to work with, and is more likely to just break than it is to split properly. So, and then I just start trimming. Trimming. And it does take a long time, especially because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I want it to be as similar to the previous row's width stitches as possible. If you keep trimming on one side, you're going to end up with a thick side and a thin side, and then it won't split very well. So you want to always keep trimming towards the middle until you get about the thickness you want. And you feel it. It's like, okay, that's definitely gonna just snap if I try and bend that too much. So I gotta start then. And sometimes it'll just do it by itself. It'll start splitting by itself, and you can very carefully just take off that thicker inner part, because a branch is round, right? So you're preserving the round part and taking away the inner flat part. See, like this is the outside of the branch. This is the inside of the branch, and that's the flat part. You're always going to be taking away the flat part and leaving the curved part. And that's what's going to go around and around, is the curved part always faces out. Always. To increase stitches, to increase size of it, you're just going to do 2 stitches in the same hole. Come on, see here, I got to use my teeth. You got to use 2 stitches in the same hole to increase the size. Do I have, yeah, like right here. I've done that. I've got 2 stitches in 1 hole, and that helps increase the diameter of it. Pine needles were not a traditional material so far as we know. I've never seen one. I've seen no evidence of pine needles being a core material in baskets right in this area in Central California. One thing they did use, though, this is a type of bunch grass. Here's the seeds from it up here, and you can see it's quite tall. It's probably, well, here it is on the ground, you know, at least 3 feet tall or more. And just as you would coil over 1 or 3 willow rods, you can stitch over a bundle of these grass stems, and you know, they're nice and long. You can go quite some ways before you need to add more grass stems. But a bundle coil is another type of coiled basket in this area. So when splitting and stitching with these, you want to start with the ground end and then work this way, because it's much less likely to split. If you start with the skinny end and go this way toward the ground end, then it's more likely to kind of peel off and split, and you can tell which is which. There's actually a little bit of stuff. I didn't scrape that quite clean enough last spring. That where the leaf was is actually sort of a little exclamation point, if you can see that. There's a little dot and then an arrow pointing up where the leaf was toward the top end, or the sky end, and the earth end is the other end. So anytime you're splitting, you want to use that grain of the wood to your advantage. I also have here, I'm using some beads as sizing tools for the middles of the baskets. Like on this one here, it's a single rod, right? Obviously 1 rod. 3 rods is another common center for baskets, and you want to make sure that's always the same size as you work. It's not getting bigger or smaller. So you use one of these beads, probably this one, to make sure that it's always the same size all the way along, so that your core stays the same size. And I have 4 different sizes for obviously different sizes of core rods. So I hope you enjoyed my little over-explaining on baskets and how to make them in a traditional way. Leave me some suggestions in the comments on what you would like to see me over-explain about next. Thanks. See you next time.